right, so everybody, welcome to USF Transportation Seminar Series on Friday. And my name is Yu Zhang. I'm a professor in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering and also serve as the director for NISA, National Institute for Congestion Reduction, a US DOT National University Transportation Center. And our transportation seminar series is sponsored by the department and also Carter Center for Urban Transportation Research, and co-sponsored by several UTCs at USF, and facilitated by ITE Student Chapter. So today, we're very glad to have Mr. Todd Romberger with us, and he's the Senior Vice President of the Spaceports Business Unit at Space Florida. He's responsible for implementation of strategic objectives across all spaceport related functions of the organization. So Space Florida's portfolios of spaceports assets, including the former shuttle landing facility, Launch Complex 20, Launch Complex 46, Exploration Park, the Space Life Science Laboratory, and the Commercial Crew Cargo Processing Facility, among other existing and future developments. So before joining the Spaceport, Todd served as Vice President of Commercial Space for Space Florida, where he was responsible for Space Florida business development activities in the emerging space tech market, leading capture and execution of several marquee Space Florida projects, including Airbus, OneWeb satellites, high volume satellite production facility, etc. So prior to joining the Space Florida, Todd held operational roles throughout the commercial space industry, including as a satellite operator of the Genesis 1 and the Genesis 2 experimental expendable spacecraft at Bigelow Aerospace, and as a weightless flight coach for Zero-G, where he has accumulated over 500 weightless parabolas on commercial flights. He has also held engineering roles at Lockheed Martin and SRC Aerospace. Todd was the first person to test a beer designed for consumption in space in a microgravity environment, and has served as a crew member of the Mars Desert Research Station. He holds a Bachelor of Science in Aerospace Engineering from the University of Central Florida. So today, Todd will talk about Florida airspace space system. And I don't know if he will mention about his experience of testing the beer. So let's see. All right, Todd, the floor is all yours, and we look forward to your presentation.
Well, thank you for the kind introduction, and it's my pleasure to speak with you today. I think hopefully this presentation might be enlightening for some of the students and some of the folks in your environment there about space as a mode of transportation in Florida, which is kind of a unique thing and something that is pretty exciting for the state, and certainly a very active and growing transportation segment in the state. So I'll just get into it. I like to start with an overall look at the space economy to sort of set the context for what we are used to seeing for space, which is, especially in Florida, used to seeing the sort of the fire and smoke of the rocket launches. But I want to put that in context of the space economy as a whole. Now, the aggregate number here is a little bit old. I think this is maybe 2 to 3 years old, but the proportionality of these different segments is still very valid. I think that the total space economy now is probably closer to about 400 billion, give or take. But if you look at this chart, if you look at about 9 o'clock on the dial there, you see small.
Todd, sorry for interrupting. I don't know if just me or others. Oh, now I see the chat. A moment ago, I didn't see.
There may be a long delay. I'll keep that in mind.
All right, thank you.
So yeah, if you can see this kind of pie chart now, the green sliver about 9 o'clock says launch services. And so launch as a portion of the space economy is relatively small. And so it's good to keep this sort of in mind as we talk about space as a mode of transportation, because really what we're doing, as in a lot of modes of transportation, is we are, a lot of the value is in what is being transported. But I think this is good context there. I'm going to go to the next slide here, and hopefully it shows up. But what some of the drivers to industry growth that we're seeing now are a couple things. One of the big ones is just what everybody has in their pocket and has in their hand, probably right now, scrolling through, is bandwidth and data consumption, mobile especially. And so that is driving, in large part, a demand for launch and space transportation activities to get satellites into the sky to provide global connectivity. So there's a number of global constellations that are being deployed now. One of them is called Starlink, which is being deployed by SpaceX. But there are other competing systems as well. One is a company called OneWeb Satellites. And they are also, you have companies like Amazon that are proposing communication constellations. You have a number of satellite companies that are proposing direct connectivity between the satellite in orbit and your phone in your hands, bypassing the towers in many cases. So this is a new development that is really one of the primary drivers to the growth we're seeing in space transportation. Another driver, which is a technology driver, is reusable launch vehicles. I think by this point, most people are probably familiar, at least on the periphery, with the fact that rockets are coming back to land, both on, back at the spaceport or on a offshore platform, and then the rockets are coming back to be reused. This is a relatively new development. I think the first time this was done successfully for an orbital rocket was by SpaceX in 2015. So this reusability is driving up volume of launches, and it's driving down the cost per kilogram to sending something to space. And that's a hugely important development in the space transportation sector. There's also changes in how the government buys space, so to speak. So in the past, there's been a lot of cost plus contracting that did little to incentivize results or low cost operations. So that's changing from cost plus to more fixed price delivery models. And the government's also changing their approach from buying and owning the system or the rocket vehicle itself, no longer being owned by the government. It's being owned by the private sector, and the government is simply buying the service. So my next chart, when it comes up for you, I wanted to highlight that from the standpoint of spaceports, it's certainly a very active landscape globally. So I think we're fortunate to have probably the premier spaceport right here in Florida that has, it's really the most active, the most capable spaceport in the world. But certainly we are not alone in spaceports at large. And this is a good thing. This means that the industry is robust and is driving demand globally for spaceports, sort of proliferation of spaceports around the globe. You can see, assuming the slide has come up there, the 2022 orbital launches. The US has a little less than half globally. China has a large chunk, Russia, and then you can see the rest are pretty small. In terms of the US launches, I think last year Florida had, I think, 57 or so of those 87. So Florida remains the dominant player in the US in terms of spaceports. But one thing, just purpose of this slide is to just sort of remind ourselves that it is a competitive landscape. It's not a given that the activity that we are, my organization, Space Florida, is working to attract to Florida. It's not a given that that activity will come here necessarily. There are a lot of other viable options out there, and certainly a lot of, very active competitive landscape. The next slide is just to show the spaceport landscape in the US specifically. So this shows sites that are licensed by the FAA for either horizontal, vertical, or both. And also there's a new category of a reentry site license, which is, this is for spacecraft that are returning from orbit, most likely horizontal landing under a lifting body configuration. So landing on a runway requires a specific modification to the FAA site license to allow for that landing consideration. And those licenses are designed in large part to protect the general public. And so there's a lot of analysis that goes into making sure that the risk profiles are acceptable, and so that not any airport can just call themselves a spaceport without having to go through this this process of licensing. So with that competitive landscape in mind, part of my job is to consider how Florida competes in this landscape. How do we compete for activity? How do we enable this space activity in the state? And one of the ways we do that, which is unique, I think, in the US, is that in Florida, space is formally considered a mode of transportation. And we do that by, it's mapped out in Florida statute, but that means a couple of things. One is it means that the state is able to invest in space as a mode of transportation in a similar, albeit much smaller way, but in a similar manner as other modes of transportation are invested in by the state. The other competitive advantage I think we have is that in Florida, there's not just one spaceport. It's something we consider to be a system, Florida Spaceport system. And so the concept here, this slide sort of shows the more of a concept than focus on a specific dots on that map. But the concept is that it takes a lot of elements of this system to enable space as a mode of transportation. So all the freight and logistics to get things to and from a spaceport. You have things like seaports that are increasingly an important part of the space economy, because you have rockets that are landing offshore, coming into a port, being offloaded, so that those port and maritime operations are becoming increasingly part of the space economy. You've got assembly, manufacturing, testing, supply chain, all throughout the state. So this is something that touches not just Cape Canaveral or the other licensed spaceports. It's truly a statewide enterprise, and really a system that's how we think of it. And I think that's an advantage that we use in that system level thinking to try to compete as the sector grows. On my next slide here, I just wanted to show quickly what are the spaceport territories in the state. And so there are a number of them. Obviously, Cape Canaveral is, and the Kennedy Space Center is sort of the most marquee one, certainly the most active and largest. But there's also a licensed spaceport outside of Jacksonville, Cecil Spaceport, that's managed by the Jacksonville Aviation Authority. And there is one in Titusville, that as well, licensed spaceport in Titusville, a few minutes away from the Cape. And we have additional spaceport territory in the Panhandle at Eglin and at Cape San Blas. So this goes to show the sort of the statewide reach of the spaceport system in Florida, and the fact that these territories are defined statutorily means that certain capabilities that I'll talk about in a few minutes can be applied on a variety of properties in Florida as part of this system. So Space Florida, the entity I work for, is charged with growing and diversifying the aerospace industry in the state. So one of our responsibilities under that is to a planning functionality, and also we implement what we call the Spaceport Improvement Program, which I'll talk about shortly. So on the planning front, we integrate with other federal partners that such as NASA and the U.S. Space Force that do their own planning exercises for the portions of spaceport property that are under their management. But Space Florida does sort of a statewide system look. So we've produced, the last iteration of this was in 2018, the Florida Spaceport System Plan. So this helps to guide the state's investment in spaceport infrastructure and space transportation infrastructure in the state. This plan and this document is integrated into the Florida DOT's strategic intermodal system plan. So this is one of the manners in which space is recognized by FDOT as a formal mode of transportation. On the next slide, we talk about one thing that's important, I think, to think about in terms of spaceports today is that they're different than they were in the past. So I think if you look back historically, going back to the early days of the space program, the spaceport is simply a place to maybe process and then launch. So we used to use the term ship and shoot. So things would be made somewhere else in another state and be shipped to Florida, and then Florida was just the place where it's launched. But as that opening pie chart showed, launch is a very small sliver of the overall space economy. So we are mindful that a spaceport should be considered more as an economic center than just a launch center. And so a modern spaceport is sort of trying to show that modern spaceport is more than just a place where you launch. It also goes into the platform, so that could be manufacturing of the cargo that is being shipped or the satellites. And then eventually that will go into operating those satellites on orbit, and which is where some of the big chunks of that pie were. But for this to all work, there's a layer of enabling infrastructure that is required for this mode of transportation to grow and for the spaceport system to grow. So things like launch pads, runways are sort of obvious. We need processing facilities for cargo and payloads and also crew. Basic things like roads and bridges, utilities, fuel. These are all important infrastructure to the spaceport system, and it's something, these are the focuses of the Spaceport Improvement Program, which I'll go into next. So Spaceport Improvement Program is funded by Florida Department of Transportation. It is managed by Space Florida. And so what we do is we put out an annual call for projects to the space industry where specific projects are proposed to be funded by this. And there's a vetting process to ensure that the project is ready, it's real, it can benefit multiple users, multiple customers. And so we go through that sort of racking and stacking to determine where the state's investment should go into the spaceport system. So we maintain a very close and very collaborative working relationship with the Spaceports office at FDOT to implement this program. And it's been very successful to date, and especially in competing in this the current landscape. So there has been about this program not only drives state investment in spaceport infrastructure, but perhaps more importantly, it drives private investment in the spaceport infrastructure. This is something that may be a little bit unique to other modes of transportation, in that the vast majority, and you can see on this chart here that about 83% of the investment has been made by the aerospace partner or the companies that we work with. And the state investment is about 17% of that over the life of this program thus far, which has been about a little over 10 years, starting in 2012. So there's a couple examples on the slides of things that have been invested in by this program. So when you look at some of the big name players in space these days, SpaceX, Blue Origin, United Launch Alliance, these are all operations that have benefited from these investments. We've also done things at, as I mentioned, some of the other spaceport territories, Cecil, and we're making some more investments in the Titusville Spaceport as well. So there has been this, the next chart, when it comes up for you, will show some of the historical investment, which we've done. This chart's a little bit old. We've done about $300 million of state investment since the program started in 2012. And so that's about, let's say, 10 years of roughly 300 million. There is expected to be an additional 300 million in investment over the next 5 years. So that's almost a doubling of the rate. And this is driven in large part by the growth of the industry. Every year when we do this call for projects and call for applications, we get an increasing number of applications. The projects are getting bigger, and it just shows that there is a very strong and robust demand for this infrastructure, and the industry continues to grow pretty rapidly. This I'll touch briefly on, which is, a lot of what we do, certainly at the Cape, is in partnership with some of the federal operators there. Obviously, NASA is the landowner for the Kennedy Space Center, and Space Florida's role in that. Oftentimes we will lease land from NASA or lease facilities from NASA. And then by doing so, it will allow us to invest some of those state funds into those facilities to enable them to be used by commercials. So we sort of fill a gap between what commercial companies might expect as a base level of infrastructure and what the federal government is able to invest in, which is in most of the time very limited to their specific mission set. So having all these commercial operators out at the Cape, for example, it's good for everybody, but it may be slightly outside the mission set of, say, NASA or the Space Force, and so therefore they're not able to invest in infrastructure that primarily benefits commercial. Well, that's where the state comes in to do that and continue to provide us with that competitive advantage, both domestically and globally. So this is a couple examples of projects that we've done. The top left is the Boeing Starliner facility. This is a former space shuttle hangar that has been converted for use by Boeing to manufacture their crewed space capsule. Top middle is OneWeb Satellites. This is one of the highest volume satellite production facilities in the world. This is at the Cape and on land that is leased by Space Florida. And again, this is producing cargo that is flying to space now from Florida. And so this, because of that production of cargo, it's able to leverage this program. Blue Origin has a very large campus for manufacturing and launch of their large orbital system called New Glenn. The bottom is the former space shuttle runway. It's called the Shuttle Landing Facility. We've since renamed it to the Launch and Landing Facility, as Space Florida has a long-term use agreement and development agreement with NASA for that property. So we're the operator and essentially the developer of that site. and we have licensed it as a commercial horizontal takeoff and landing spaceport, and are pursuing a lot of infrastructure development there that is attracting new tenants to come and build facilities adjacent to that runway. This is a very unique runway. It's 3 miles long, one of the longest in the world. It's perfectly flat. It's entirely NASA engineered to perfection. It's a really unique asset, and it's going to be a growing centerpiece of the industry growth in Florida. And then the bottom there is the Orion capsule being assembled by Lockheed Martin, which was one of the first projects under this program that we implemented going back several years. But it's not just all those types of facilities. There's a lot of horizontal infrastructure and things that you might not see as you're driving around the spaceport that is also critical to enabling the spaceport to grow. So, for example, the main artery coming into the Cape went over a bridge that was aging and needed to be replaced. So, in partnership with NASA and FDOT, we were successful in securing a federal grant to replace that bridge with a high-span bridge. So we're replacing the drawbridge with a high-span bridge. So that's a critical connector for the spaceport. Also doing things like power distribution. So a lot of these systems require power that wasn't currently there. So we work a lot with FPL on distribution projects. Also things like natural gas. So natural gas is increasingly being used as a fuel of choice by industry. And so we are looking at ways to increase the capacity of the natural gas system to service those users. And we've also done things like widen roadways. So you have very large systems that need to get transported around a spaceport. These launch vehicles in some cases are upwards of 300 feet long. These things need to, make turns and get on and off of roads. And that required a certain number of modifications to the roadway and signalization around the spaceport. One of the projects we did. We're also doing utility corridor development adjacent to that runway that I was talking about, the shuttle landing facility. That utility corridor is bringing capability that will be leveraged by new commercial development there. So if we look at some of the general trends in the industry, we're also seeing some of the, I think the marquee stuff you may see on the news is that there's proliferation of now human spaceflight. It's back, since the retirement of the space shuttle, just up until a year or so ago, we did not have any human launches from Florida. So now we're seeing that back again, thanks to the Commercial Crew Program, which is how NASA procures flights now commercially to go to the International Space Station. But because of that new model where NASA is just buying the service, the operator, for example, SpaceX, they own the system, which means they can sell that service to other private individuals that may want to fly to space. And so that's what we're seeing, both government astronauts and private commercial astronauts, a proliferation of that over the last 2 years here. You can see on the bottom row there, not all of this is from Florida, but certainly there's additional suborbital activities going on in other parts of the country. Blue Origin's launch site in West Texas, and Virgin Galactic is launching from New Mexico. On both of those are suborbital, but there's an increase in human spaceflight activity there as well. So this is something we're cognizant of because it drives a whole different requirement set as soon as we're talking about passengers at the spaceport. The next chart, I know there's probably still a delay here, but when it pops up, the next chart is just to give a sense for the fact that a lot of the activity at the spaceports is now being driven by commercial operators. So what was a primarily government operated spaceport, certainly the government is still the operator of the grounds and the owner of the dirt, but there's increasing number of commercial companies that have now leased facilities or leased property that are conducting their business operations on the spaceport. And so this just goes to show, as you look at the sort of launch pad row there, it's almost all exclusively commercial operators there. NASA still retains a pad for the Artemis program on the very north side there, but essentially everything else has been leased to commercial, because now these commercial providers are the service providers to the government for launching government payloads, etc. Quickly, we'll touch on the other spaceports in Florida and some of the projects that we have had there, which in the past and ongoing. Cecil Spaceport outside of Jacksonville. There's a spaceport development area at Cecil that we have been active in supporting both utilities and some of the facility modifications to make that more attractive for commercial space-related operations. You can see they have had a number of rocket engine testing capabilities at rocket engine tests conducted at Cecil, which is, again, an important part of the system. And then the Space Coast Air and Spaceport in Titusville also has hosted a number of operations, including some very high altitude test flights of a balloon system, which is essentially a suborbital ride to the edge of space, which provides an alternative to some of the suborbital rocket rides you see from Blue Origin and Virgin Galactic. So there's a company called Space Perspective that's operating out of the Titusville Spaceport that's proposing those tourist balloon rides essentially to the edge of space. Pretty exciting there as well. And you can see on this next slide when it comes up, this is just sort of a snapshot of some of the launch systems that are either currently flying or in development to be flying soon from Florida. So Vulcan is the United Launch Alliance's new launch vehicle that is being put into development here very shortly. SpaceX has Falcon 9, which is sort of the workhorse that does the majority of the launches right now from Florida. Falcon Heavy has a few as well. Delta Heavy is another ULA launch vehicle that will be retired here in the coming years. Those, the three with the feather on them are Blue Origins. So that is the New Glenn launch system that is being manufactured now in Florida at the spaceport. You can see what it looks like when it lands. The big silver one is SpaceX Starship. So this is SpaceX's next generation launch vehicle. Actually, just recent, I think yesterday, they did a successful static fire of most of the engines on this vehicle out of their test site in Texas. But this system, SpaceX does plan to launch from the Cape. They are building and have built the majority of a tower out there for this. And so this is something that will be coming to Florida as well. And what this does is it increases the cargo tonnage that can travel to space from Florida. And it also drives down costs because most of these systems are reusable. And so you're launching a lot of mass on a reusable system. You're driving that cost per kilogram down significantly. So on my next slide, I talk about some of the challenges that we face in space transportation at large. So space traffic management is a growing challenge. We're launching things very frequently to space, large constellations of satellites being deployed, thousands and thousands of satellites. And this is not a huge, has not created a huge impediment yet, but it's a growing potential problem for the ability to continue to launch things. You want to make sure you're not going to impact stuff that's already up there, or vice versa. And so space traffic management and very precision tracking of the items that are in orbit is very going to be increasingly important to make sure that there's not collisions and that we can continue to utilize low Earth orbit and higher orbits and without having this sort of cascading effect where it's too difficult to get through the traffic jam up there. Airspace integration, also very important. So, there's a lot of air traffic corridors, and as I'm sure you all are keenly, aware of and probably are studying these types of things. When a space launch goes off in the past, it has, caused those traffic corridors to get shut down. So as space launch becomes more frequent, it is a growing challenge to have the integration of those two modes of transportation with each other. So that airspace integration piece is very important. Also look at operational density. There's only, in Florida, where obviously there's only so much land in Florida and only so much land that can be utilized as a spaceport in Florida. And so to continue to grow the launch cadence, it's important that we find ways to increase that operational density. So that's neighboring operations that may be able to have hazardous activities at the same time, or, without causing everybody to have to clear, without having to move your neighbor essentially out of their launch pad when you are conducting a test, et cetera. So that operational density is a thing that is very important to being able to limit the constraints on growth. And then schedule certainty. This is maybe less of an issue, but as you have more launches, you want the commercial operators want to ensure that they have certainty that they're going to fly when they tell their customers they're going to fly. And so the more different operators you have at the same spaceport, the more there's that sort of friction and competition for launch dates. And so making sure you have schedule certainty is critical to this growth. On the next slide, just want to highlight that space is a very multimodal segment of transportation. So on this slide, when it comes up, you'll see we're rolling rockets over the highways. It's not that uncommon to see one of these Falcon 9s rolling down the highway somewhere in the country, being shipped from its production facility in California to the Cape. A lot of things come in by rail. As I mentioned before, maritime and seaports are becoming increasingly important part of the puzzle. And air obviously is always important, but we bring a lot of payloads in via air. And so it's a very multimodal, connected mode of transportation. And we expect that to only continue. I'm going to close out the remarks with sort of 8 themes that we think are important to being able to adapt and compete over the next decade. So this comes from a sort of 2030 roadmap for the spaceport system on themes that we think are important. So one is this system level thinking. It's kind of like what I opened with, is that we need to think about the way that it's not individual spaceports as an island. It is a system that enables the spaceport activity in Florida to be able to be successful. So that may come with specialization of certain spaceport territories. It may, come with, enhancing things that are off the spaceport to enable things to get to or from the spaceport. So that system level thinking is important. New capital sources, also hugely important. A lot of other modes of transportation, specifically airports, seaports, use revenue bonds to fund their growth. So we have yet to employ that funding source on the space side, but it's important that that becomes part of the mix. So you will always have private investment. You'll always have a strong level of state support and investment, but having the ability to issue revenue bonds or debt based on revenue stream from the spaceport is really the kind of a critical stepping stone to enabling a lot of growth at the spaceport. So the next one is increased launch capacity. So clearly talked about density of operations a little bit, but You know, we expect, I think this last year we had 57 launches. We expect to have 100 plus within just a few short years here. And so increasing that operational frequency and operational density at Spaceport is important, especially when you're geographically constrained. And so there may be new approaches to things like cross waivers or insurance. You may have concept where there's sort of an interoperability of launch sites, kind of like you have terminals at an airport today, or potential for multi-use or cost-shared facilities. You're also going to, thinking out there are ways. Maybe there's things like offshore platforms for launch, not just landing, but for launch as well. Or there's a lot of concepts for how to increase the launch capacity, but it's important that we continue to keep our eye on that. Integration of maritime operations into the space segment is also only going to increase. So it's important that we normalize that maritime is a part of space. And that means making sure that there's capacity at our seaports to support space-related activities. We're also going to see an increase in passenger traffic. As I mentioned, you got a lot more crewed human flights coming out of Florida and elsewhere. And so this is going to drive a whole new requirement set. So passenger terminals, accommodations, training, things that have historically been limited just to governmental use are going to be needed by the commercial sector as well. So this drives a whole new sort of requirement set, something we got to keep our eye on that ball. Spaceport governance is also going to be important. You've got these spaceports that are currently operated by federal entities. I know there's a large exercise going on within those federal entities to try to figure out how to optimize that model going forward. What should the government's role be? What should the state's role be? How does this work now that we have the majority of the activity is commercial, not government at these spaceports? So we need to continue to sort of embrace new thinking on what is the best governance model for these spaceports moving forward. And I think these last two are kind of looking out there a little bit farther, but maybe not as far as it may seem. So in space elements, so there will be things like refueling stations in space. There will be things like, commercial factories in space, proliferation of commercial destinations in space. And this will somewhat, change the landscape a little bit as these, launch becomes commoditized and these capabilities in space proliferate. The model of the spaceport as just a geographically ground-based operation may get disrupted a bit. So we need to think about, how do we integrate a fueling station? How is that part of the state's look at space transportation infrastructure, for example? And then lastly, interplanetary commerce. So, we expect to have, through the efforts of companies like SpaceX and certainly the civil space programs, and these two are married together increasingly in terms of reliance on each other to get to destinations like the moon and certainly Mars. But there will be, we think in the next, call it 10 years, interplanetary commerce. So you're going to have goods and services going back and forth between the Earth and the moon. And so how do we make sure we're prepared for that? Do we have the right tax and regulatory environment for that? Do we have things like inspections, customs, security, things that you have in other modes of transportation? How do we deal with those when we're transiting goods back and forth between other planetary bodies? So with that, I kind of leave you with those forward-looking thoughts, and hope this was insightful, and I would be more than happy to take any questions from the group.
Wonderful presentation. Thank you so much, Todd. Yeah, we do have questions from audience. So the first question is, it's my impression from Ken's side, and he said, "It's my impression that SpaceX is far ahead of other space launch providers in innovation and cost reduction, and so has great potential to capture most of the commercial, defense, foreign government, and NASA launch businesses." If that's so, how does the future figure into Florida space planning?
Yeah, I think that's correct, that SpaceX, really prior to SpaceX sort of coming online, a lot of the commercial launch activity had moved overseas because the domestic launch capability is too expensive for commercial. So when SpaceX started flying in earnest, it brought the majority of that commercial activity back to the US, which is a great thing, and brought a lot of that to Florida. So yeah, I agree that they are well positioned. That's probably putting it mildly. They're really pretty dominant in the market. But that's not to say that there's not room for other players. And again, transportation is a critically important piece of it, but it's also, you've got a lot of players that are building the things that go on the top of the rockets that are going to go up there. So I don't know if any of that answers your questions, but a lot of the growth we've seen and a lot of the growth in launch cadence has been due to SpaceX. And we continue to partner with them closely and continue to make investments in the space that they, not only SpaceX can leverage, but other companies, including Blue Origin, ULA, and others, can also leverage as well to continue to increase that launch capability.
Thanks, Todd. So you mentioned that in 2022 there was 57 launches, and you also showed the unique runway for the spaceship. So I was wondering, for the 57s, are all those like a vertical launches, or
yes,
also the launches?
Yeah,
so,
all of those are vertical. We have not had a horizontal launch off of that runway yet.
Okay. And also, the launching condition is very critical, right? We have observed sometimes you have to wait, like the launcher has to be delayed because of, it's not optimal, like launching condition. And then when we talk about increase the frequency, increase the commercial operations. So will there be any like technical or technology breakthrough that can make the launching conditions like not so critical? Like, is there any breakthrough that can kind of have more flexibility to launch the spaceship on the various different like less optimal conditions?
Yeah, I think you're onto a very important point. One of the things that has happened recently, which is it's not ubiquitous yet, but it's trending that way, is something called autonomous flight safety systems. So if you look back in history, most of the launches, certainly all of the early launches from the 1960s going all the way up through, the 2000s, 2010s, or under a traditional flight safety system, which means that there is a tracking of the vehicle from the ground using radar, and then you have a human in the loop to ensure that if the vehicle goes off course, that there's someone hits the button to terminate that before it poses any threat to the uninvolved public. And that has been the traditional model. Well, that requires a lot of ground infrastructure, requires a lot of human infrastructure to operate those systems and to manage them. It introduces complicating factors like human error, et cetera, into it. So one of the advances that is already being put in place called autonomous flight safety. So this is a unit that's on the vehicle that is autonomously tracking the vehicle's trajectory and will automatically detect if it goes off course, and then it will terminate the thrust on the vehicle to prevent it from impacting the public. So because that technology minimizes ground infrastructure needed, a lot of the delays that you used to see, I mean, oftentimes when there was a technical reason for canceling a launch, you know, maybe half the time or more, it might have to do with a system that is not even on the rocket itself. It may be one of those tracking systems. A lot of that has been eliminated through the introduction of this new technology. I think you're always going to have constraints like weather. You know, Florida's relatively good for weather for launching, but you will always have those kind of constraints. But those types of autonomous advances, I think, are what's going to drive what you're talking about.
That's great. That's great. Okay, another comment from Ken that is more for the benefits of who are interested in watching the launches of the spaceships. So what he said was, watching from the beach immediately north of the launch pads, launches to the north are best because they go overhead. Watching from Tampa, launches to the south are best to watch because they arc across the east sky. It would be great if the Cape would indicate ahead of time which direction launches will go.
Yeah, that's a good point. You know, and that information may be, I'm not sure if it's always publicly available, because certain, and you know, it becomes sort of obvious once you see the launch which direction it's going, but oftentimes the customer for a launch may not want their orbital location advertised. And so it's not necessarily always something that's communicated publicly prior to the launch. But sometimes it is. There's probably places you can go online where folks have, you know, figured that out or predicted that, but I wouldn't know the best source for that information.
You are a weightless flight coach. So how difficult as just the general public to be trained, so can to like being in a human space flight in the future? I know Bezos did that, so I think if he could do that, I think most of us probably can also do that. So can you comment on that?
Sure. Yeah. I was a weightless flight coach. I interned at the company called Zero Gravity, which or Zero G, which does those weightless flights in an airplane. And so as part of that internship when I was in college, I sort of stuck on as a part-time coach a couple times a year maybe. But I would agree with you, it is something that anyone can do in terms of the physical effects on the body. It's pretty benign and it's a lot of fun. And it is you know, it's a really unique sensation to be weightless. And you know, I think it's part of the excitement and part of the, you know, the reason that people are. I'd agree. I think anybody can do it. I think you saw one of those flights from Blue Origin that William Shatner, the actor, was on, and he's, I think, was 90 years old maybe when he went, and he did just fine. And so it's something anybody can do. And that's the thing. Another thing is this commercial space flight becomes more and more proliferated, that the notion that it's only for the elite or only for the super specialty trained, you know, you don't have to be a Ironman, you know, triathlon athlete to be able to do it. You can just be a regular person, and chances are you're going to be just fine and enjoy it.
Great, thank you. So Diva, I want to ask if the students in the classroom have any questions.
Yeah, we have a student, Dennis, who has a question. Please go ahead.
So I was wondering, lost my train of thought. Yeah, so when I was in Sarasota about about a year ago, it was weird seeing a rocket launch from somewhere other than Kennedy Space Center. It looked like it came from MacDill Air Force Base. Yeah, it's the point of view from downtown Sarasota. Yeah, I was driving on Highway 41. Yeah.
I don't know that date. If there's military activities, those are certainly something that's not advertised in advance in most cases. So I'm not sure about that specific case, but certainly in Florida, the majority of all the launches are coming out of the Cape.
Yeah.
Okay, any other questions from the students in the classroom?
I think the students have,
Yeah, go ahead. What?
yeah, but no one has a question yet. Thank you.
Okay. All right, thank you, Diva. All right, so let me double check the meeting chat. I do not see additional questions, but just a thank you notes from the audience. So Todd, again, thank you so much for delivering this talk. And I think it's open, some of the materials definitely open the eyes of the audience. And I totally agree. I think Florida is at a really good position when a spaceship actually considered as one of the transportation modes. And so we really look forward to observe more launches and see the development of the commercial space flights in Florida. Thank you again for come with us and deliver this talk.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.